All right. Now, cultural memory in Tang, China. I'm very grateful for the opportunity in the Academy of Sinology to present on this particular module. It's one of the 5 modules in the BA Sinology Humanistic Education. Now, as you may know, Tang Dynasty China lasted for some 300 years. It's been celebrated as a golden age of economic prosperity as well as cultural flourishing. It's been known as the second great age of Chinese empire, and one that many have considered to have surpassed the first age, the Han Empire. And interestingly, Emperor Taizong, who was the second Tang emperor, is credited with consolidating this particular dynasty, the foundations that helped it last for centuries. And he's very much remembered for his exemplary rulership. In fact, his reign, which was called the Jingguan reign, came to be known synonymous with good government. Now, this particular module looks at how the exemplary rulership of Emperor Taizong came to be. And it does so through this book on the right, called The Essentials for Bringing About Order from Assembled Texts, known in Chinese as the Qufu Zhiyao. Now, this is an anthology. It's a compilation of excerpts from 68 different sources. And it's an anthology on the art of rulership, on statecraft, that was compiled for the young emperor within the first 5 years of his reign. And for this sample lecture, I'm going to set aside matters of textual transmission and various editions to focus on the place of this particular text, the essentials. We call the essentials for bringing about order from assembled texts, just essentials for short. The place of the essentials in the Mirrors for Princes genre. Now, you might be wondering, what is this particular genre of literature? Well, the Mirrors for Princes is an ancient tradition of literature. It certainly includes writings that span civilizations in both the East and West. And the writings take, there are so many forms that's highly various in terms of the specific forms it takes. For example, it includes dialogues, novels, dramas, speeches, treatises. But these writings all have, what they all have in common is that they're designed for the moral and political education of a current or a future ruler. And sometimes this even extends to the ruler's advisors, like their officials. And as you can see from this particular quote, states about mirrors dating to the Afro-Eurasian Middle Ages were characterized by the derivation of principles, rules, and norms from historical examples, so really learning from history that would allow the reader to make their being, how they are as a person, cultivating their character, and their governing, how they went about their rulership, to conform to the model of the ideal ruler, and thereby ensure the well-being of the political community. Now, you understand where the design for the moral and political education of the rulers and possibly even their advisors as well, that shines through this particular quote. Now, interestingly, this genre of literature took shape in medieval China. And of course, Tang China fits into that period. And certainly here are some English versions of just a handful of these mirror writings. And you can see they really span, Eurasia and even Africa as well. Now, interestingly, as I mentioned before, this particular genre took shape in medieval China in the 7th and 8th centuries. And these writings were certainly distinct from the canonical or classics and philosophical writings, also known as the masters. And how they're different is that those existing writings tend to focus on the ideas of a particular philosopher or thinker, their proposals or interactions with certain rulers, and their coverage of governmental matters within a broader philosophy. So those sorts of these classics or masters' writings, they read more like a record of the life's work of a particular thinker or a philosopher, rather than a manual, something a bit more purpose-built and designed for a ruler or their advisor. So a bit more practical oriented are these mirror writings in particular. Now, interestingly, there's been at least three of these mirror writings are related to Emperor Taizong, and I list them out here. They are the Golden Mirror that was promulgated by Emperor Taizong in the year 628, so within 2 years of his ascending the throne. And this was a sort of a brief manifesto on how he thought about sort of securing the long-term stability of the empire as a young emperor. Now, 20 years later, in the year 648, he has the model for an emperor penned for his successor. And this is a much more detailed program of what you might call the best administrative practices off the back of his 20-odd years of experience on the throne. Now, after the life of Taizong and his reign, in around the year 729, is another mirror writing, and it's written by a historian, and it provides an idealized historical account of Emperor Taizong and his interactions with his court officials, and how they went about this practice of government that they came to be really well known for. And here we have a recent English translation of this particular mirror writing. And through the broad interest in Taizong's exemplary rulership and the dissemination of these mirror writings, Emperor Taizong actually came to be a universal, a real model for courts, not just in East Asia, but right throughout Europe. And this is a recent article that really identifies, just the first line from the abstract. From the middle decades of the 18th century, the Tang Emperor Taizong was cited in French, German, English, Italian, and Dutch books and periodicals as a universal model of good governance. Now, it goes on to explain how Taizong inspired 2 works from German writers, and really they were also works designed for reform of political, social reform. So sort of caught the imagination of thinkers, beyond just Tang China. Now, given that the Essentials was compiled for Emperor Taizong, who was a young sovereign, getting to grips with the art of rulership early on in his reign. I'm curious as to, would the Essentials have a place in among the mirror writings associated with Emperor Taizong? And I'm going to use this time to explore this idea based on the 3 criteria set out here: the intended audience and purpose of the Essentials, its contents, and how it was used. So without further ado, as I mentioned before, the intended purpose was pretty clear. Emperor Taizong had ascended the throne. He had come from a military background. He had sort of helped to sort of ensure the success of his father in founding the Tang dynasty, the fledgling Tang dynasty at the time. And he was conscious of the fact that he had sort of missed out on much of the formal learning that one would usually expect an emperor to be across. And so he needed to get across the readings for rulership and learn on the job. And so we see here, which is an extract from the original preface to the Essentials, written by its chief compiler, Wei Zheng. And it sort of sets out the commission. We've therefore been asked to select from diverse texts to excise the irrelevant, regular, and illuminate exemplary standards to make it easier for Emperor Taizong, the essential readings, basically. And not only is Emperor Taizong the principal reader as the intended audience, this was an imperially commissioned work for him, by him, for himself, but Wei Zheng anticipates that the Essentials will provide a reference for posterity as well, as indicated in the next passage. So certainly the intended purpose and audience fits, you'd say, ticks a box for a mirror writing. Now, but beyond Emperor Taizong, when the completed Essentials was presented to the throne, we know from this record that within a month of that formal presentation, Emperor Taizong wrote a handwritten note to Wei Zheng complimenting him, praising this work, and directing that all of his sons, the princes, each be given a copy too. So naturally found it useful enough to commend to his princes, including the crown prince, his successor, so that it'd be part of their reading and their training. So that was also part of the intended audience, I suppose. But what about its contents? Mentioned that it was a compilation of excerpted material from 68 different sources. And as Wei Zheng mentions, this broad range of texts, comprehensive coverage. It covers classical works or canonical works, historical writings, as well as the masters or philosophers. So these are 3 out of the 4 traditional bibliographical classifications in the Palace Library. And in terms of time period, the contents span, from the earliest periods in China's history right through to the Tang dynasty, which was one of the dynasties sort of in the Tang China's modern history, you'd say, recent history. And because it seeks to capture the gist of governance, clear and concise, it's given its name as the Essentials of Bringing About Order. Now, certainly the contents were very much designed to help Emperor Taizong get across the readings he needed for rulership. But what were these excerpted sources about? Well, through this particular passage from the preface, we know that it features instructive accounts about historical exemplars. And these exemplars were monarchs, sovereigns, rulers, as well as their advisors, their officials, including the imperial women as well. And it's interesting that you have both positive exemplars, so examples for the ruler to emulate, to learn from, as well as the negative role models, so cautionary tales. And it certainly captures the imagination, as we can read here. Enlightened monarchs redeem the times by their self-sacrifice, and unscrupulous rulers jeopardize with their self-indulgence. So no merit or fault goes unrecorded. They aim to be, but not only clear and concise, but also, comprehensive at the same time. Now, what was fascinating is that the Essentials, it's an anthology of lots of excerpted materials, but they didn't follow convention in grouping their excerpts by topic. Here, Wei Zheng mentions these existing compilations on statecraft, known as the Imperial Conspectus and the Comprehensive Digest of the Institute of the Floral Grove, that group by subject and suffer from reiteration or duplication, as you can imagine, certain entries might be relevant to more than one topic. And so what the approach that they took to the essentials is essentially keeping the excerpts within their sources and grouping them by their sources. So not only would it be sort of a handy reference on statecraft generally, but it would also provide a handy reference for, you can imagine, a repertoire of quotable quotes, which was customary to cite as part of, the court communications, especially of the educated elite. So it was, doubly useful in that count. On top of that, the existing references, as I mentioned earlier, they came to over 600 scrolls, pretty voluminous materials. Now, if you can imagine being the emperor, he didn't have a lot of time, having to also learn on the job. And so what the editors did for Emperor Taizong, they put together the essentials totaling 50 scrolls altogether, sort of a fraction of the existing resources on statecraft. And you can imagine walking into the palace library and being confronted with tens of thousands of texts and scrolls altogether. Where do you start? So this made the readings, the learning accessible for the young ruler. And so we have this particular quote, from the historian David McMullen, and he's also a sinologist. He describes the essentials as a 7th century equivalent of a sizable encyclopedia of political wisdom intended to save the emperor reading time. It offered the efficient route to minimum learning, and that was what Taizong needed. So clearly, not only in terms of the intended purpose and audience, but the contents so far really tick the box as a mirror writing. Now, what about if we look inside the book, beyond the preface? Well, we get a taste of the exemplars that we've heard about. Now here, this is these words attributed to the Grand Guardian Duke Shao, spoken apparently 3,000 years ago. And he's giving advice to King Wu of the Zhou dynasty, one of the founding fathers. And the king has just received some gifts. These are gifts of some hounds. So obviously, hounds is a gift from the Lu tribe. Clearly a foreign breed fit to be a gift for the king. And the Duke warns the king to, be cautious, not to be distracted by these exotic animals or to prize foreign treasures, but rather to treasure the worthy officials, the worthy talent, as we can see here. Now, interestingly, the Essentials also excerpts the commentaries in the form of annotations to ensure that the emperor would understand the correct interpretations that the editors had in mind. There wouldn't be any confusion. And so certainly what comes across in this passage is a caution or warning, advice for the emperor not to be distracted, and particularly to remember to value these worthy officials and to look out for such worthy talent, because it's only through treasuring and prioritizing such talent that can bring peace to those near and far. And just as interesting as what is in the Essentials is what's not. Omitted is when we look at the venerated documents. In the received version, we have more detail, as you can imagine. We know when the circumstances in which these hounds were gifted, but clearly not in essential detail. But what's important is these ancient words showing what has been valued, what should be valued for an incumbent ruler or ruler to be. But that's very general. And you're left sort of wondering, well, who are these worthy officials? What do they look like? How do we know? How do we find these worthy officials? Well, look, there's another passage, and this is an excerpt from the Analects. And it's in a sort of a dialogue that keeps things lively. And it's as if Zigong, this is a dialogue between Confucius and Zigong, one of his students. And it's as if Zigong has read the reader's mind. He asks Confucius, who are the worthy ministers today? It's as if, are there any worthy officials? Does worthy talent exist today? And Confucius right away provides historical examples. He said, the state of Qi has Bao Shu, state of Zheng has Zi Pi. And so right away, what could have been, quite abstract is brought to life. You have real historical individuals who have been worthy officials. Now, what about them? Well, the dialogue explains that a worthy official is someone who is willing and able to recommend other worthy officials. So clearly they contribute meritorious service in two ways, through their own efforts and through recommending others who can do the same. Now we have some basic idea of how to recognize worthy talent through the recommendations of other worthy officials, and that helps us be somewhat clearer. But there isn't very much detail beyond just mentioning the name. And so if we look a little bit further, these two extracts actually come from the records of the historian, sort of in the historical writings section of the Essentials. And there's a lot of words here, but I'll summarize the account. And it's about Bao Shu Ya, Bao Shu was just mentioned before, and his old friend Guan Zhong. Now, they've known each other for a very long time. They're old friends, and it's recorded that, Guan Zhong was fairly poor, often took advantage of his good friend. In fact, they even went into business together, and Guan Zhong would always divide more of the profits to himself. But in all this time that they've known each other, Bao Shu Ya never lets those sorts of matters strain the friendship. And where it's recorded that, very early on, Bao Shu Ya recognizes that Guan Zhong is, has talent. He is a worthy. And, he could really be destined for great things. They find themselves at one point working for rival factions. The leaders of those factions, Bao Shu is assisting Xiao Bai, and Guan Zhong is assisting Xiao Bai's brother. And at one point, Guan Zhong even attempts to assassinate Xiao Bai. He doesn't succeed, though. The arrow that he shoots hits the belt buckle of Xiao Bai, who pretends to be dead, but goes on to become the next ruler in the state of Qi. It's known as Lord Huan of the state of Qi. Now, Guan Zhong, being the former assassin, Lord Huan, is only too keen to see that he is put to death. And Bao Shu Ya, who's at this time appointed as Chancellor to Lord Huan, takes it on himself to voluntarily, on his own initiative, very boldly recommending Guan Zhong to be Chancellor, to actually take his place. Now, Chancellor being the top job, this is the highest official in the land, and it would have meant Bao Shu Ya having to serve, in a subordinate role. It's amazing that Bao Shu Ya would do this for Guan Zhong, putting him forward, risking the wrath of his ruler, Lord Huan. Here he is proposing his old friend, clearly opening himself to accusations of favoritism, and then also recommending someone none other than the former assassinate of Lord Huan. You can imagine the odds. But amazingly, Lord Huan is someone who's able to trust in his advisor Bao Shu Ya's good advice. He follows through in appointing Guan Zhong to the chancellorship, And sure enough, Guanzhong, brings to the state of Qi prosperity, stability, and Lord Guan becomes a hegemon, the dominant leader of the various states, other state leaders at this period of time, in the spring and autumn period in China's history. So there's incredible success, but as much as people know about Guanzhong throughout history, they know and remember and celebrate Bao Shuya as well for his ability to appreciate talent and his, I suppose, generosity of spirit in putting forward Guanzhong. He recognized his own limitations, realized, being the chancellor, he couldn't do as well a job as Guanzhong, and he was only too happy to put forward Guanzhong, sort of feeling that, it would be the same as if supporting Guanzhong would be the same as if he had served himself, continued to serve as the chancellor. So that is through Bao Shuya's shining example, sort of shows what's special about these worthy officials. They're more than happy to give up even their own position, so that the state doesn't miss out on a worthy official. So that really brings to life what could be quite abstract and dry theory, and it's certainly very engaging. Now, this is gives us a very brief flavour of the contents of the essentials. Now, how was it used? We know that beyond Emperor Taizong and his Jingguan reign, 3 memorials, these are formal pieces of writing from officials serving in later Tang courts. They specifically identify the essentials with Emperor Taizong and his reign, and in recommending the essentials to their own emperors, as listed here, sort of implies that it had been proven to be useful, maybe not just in Emperor Taizong's time. In Tang dynasty China, many, many years later, the essentials actually formed part of the reading collection of Emperor Jiaqing. And we know this because it was part of a collection of rare books called the Exclusive Collection of Wanwei that was located directly behind the Dragon Throne in the Hall of the Cultivating Heart, which was the emperor's residence as well as the centre for cultural activities and government administration. And beyond China, in pre-modern Japan, the essentials was certainly used as a mirror writing for it. It was studied and read by generations of emperors in their courts from the early 9th century, certainly disseminated by shogunates, and even became standard readings for officials by the late 9th century, as we can see in this extract here. And this was written by the son of an emperor and recommends that the essentials and the essentials of governance from the Jingguan reign, the historical account about Taizong's and his court, their practice of governance. These 2 texts offering, being all you needed to know about matters between sovereign and their subordinates for officials in Japan. So certainly, you could say, very much used as a mirror, not just in China, but also abroad. So I'm going to conclude on this note. I think the evidence and the extracts we've covered clearly point to the way that, in the essentials presents as a mirror writing belonging to this genre of political advice literature. And I'll sort of conclude on that note, the sample lecture on the cultural memory in Tang China. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.